World Affairs Roundup next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, with another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Today we'll be looking at 100 Days of Obama's Foreign Policy. Assessments of the President's performance during his first months as diplomat-in-chief are predictably varied. Have we witnessed a sea change in the way the U.S. relates to the world? Or largely a continuation of his predecessor's policies? Sending in the SWAT team. Under international pressure, Pakistani troops moved this week to reclaim territory captured by Taliban forces. Militants launched their offensive from the SWAT district, site of a controversial deal with the government in which they were to lay down their arms in exchange for de facto Taliban control of the area. How should the U.S. assist and encourage Islamabad to address what Secretary of State Clinton has called a mortal threat? Spanish Inquisition. Citing the principle of universal jurisdiction, noted Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón announced plans to proceed with an investigation into the involvement of 6 Bush administration officials in authorizing torture at Guantanamo Bay. Garzón indicated the case is based on documents declassified by the Obama administration. Who are the winners and losers in the president's handling of the torture issue? Ill feelings. In response to UN condemnation of a recent missile test, North Korean leader Kim Jong-il has expelled UN inspectors and threatened to resume production of weapons-grade plutonium. How seriously should the Obama administration take its other nuclear crisis? Joining us to explore these issues are Owen Robinson, publisher of the political blog Boots and Sabers. He's also a regular contributor to newspapers in southeastern Wisconsin. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Director of Program for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Welcome to International Focus. Owen, I think I'm going to let you not have to bat lead off in your first trip to the plate here. And let me start with you and have you take up the question about Obama's administration foreign policy we started with, which is, to what degree is the administration making a total break from the Bush policies, and to what extent is it actually continuing some of those policies?
Well, there were a lot of analyses out there in this last week for his 100 days in office, and predictably they were varied. Some people pointed to the real change in tone that the administration has set, the fact that we have reached a handout to Iran, and also to they point to the fact that Obama shook hands with Chavez down in Trinidad and Tobago, But people are also pointing to a lot of continuity in major areas. And some are either saying Bush's policy wasn't all that bad. Obama is just pursuing what Bush was already doing. But others are saying, we just don't know yet. There isn't enough time. Foreign policy is very complex. And one thing that I'd like to add to that is that foreign policy, much more than domestic policy, takes place behind closed doors. So that some of the complaints that I read in connection with this were that he hasn't formulated a policy on North Korea. He hasn't formulated a real policy on Iran. He's made some overtures but hasn't really formulated a policy. And I would argue that there's probably a lot more going on than meets the eye, and that they are thinking about a new policy in many directions, and for many of these countries. We just don't know what it is yet.
I've been very pleased, honestly, on a number of fronts. I think, during the campaign he was talking about a precipitous withdrawal from Iraq. Instead, now we have a very measured, we're pulling out troops as conditions on the ground merit. That was Bush policy. In Afghanistan, we're seeing a troop surge, the same thing Bush did in Iraq. I think we do still see, both Clinton and all the way back to Reagan and Carter had no idea what to do with Iran, and I think we still don't. North Korea is the same tough nut to crack. So I don't fault the Obama administration for not having a solid policy on that right now. Frankly, those are very difficult issues that will take a lot of time to sort out. But I think what we've seen so far is a superficial change. The change in tone, the change in personality, if you will, is certainly different. However, as far as tangible results, we really haven't seen much. We're still not getting any help from the Europeans in Afghanistan. Russia hasn't been real keen on helping us in Iran. I mean, really nothing has changed on those fronts, but hey, they like us better.
Robert, how do you see rather than a grade, what progress report would you give to the administration?
Well, I mean, foreign policy keeps going forward. International relations does, even when you have a change in regime in the United States. And so it stands to reason that you can't change everything all at once. You already are involved in Iran and in Iraq, and you have troops in Iraq. You already have an engagement in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So that's not going to change on a dime. And I think Anne's right. Some of the changes may be behind the scenes. But if you're going to do what Obama wants to do, which is have a multilateralist foreign policy which engages other countries differently, both our adversaries and our friends, and sets a very different tone and is more diplomatic, uses a lot more soft skills and diplomacy in addition to military power, then tone is very important. It's not superficial. It's extremely important to building that new foreign policy, and he's done that extremely well. His foreign policy trips both to Latin America and to Europe have been extremely successful. It is a breath of fresh air. He's made a huge distinction between his approach and what happened in the previous administration, the kind of leadership we had, and so that's created an opportunity to try to pursue this kind of foreign policy. It's much too early to see how it'll work in all the different areas. It's much too early to tell what will happen in Iran. I think it's promising that he's at least, since he's had an open hand towards Iran, create a situation where Iran looks worse both to public opinion in the world and in the Muslim world in its own public if it is aggressive in return. So whereas it was very easy to use Bush to justify a lot of belligerent policies, and I think you could go throughout the world and talk about that. His goal, I think, initially was to change the tone, and he's done it very well.
If in a lot of cases, the Obama administration has been good about checking the first item on their lists off. So they made this speech to the Muslim world. They set a policy for withdrawal in Iraq along a more measured pace. But it's that second point. I mean, so what do you see as the next sort of most important follow-up that the administration needs to make on the several initiatives that they've taken here?
I think you see a lot of, I mean, after we've had the discussions, now, we've asked, for instance, the Europeans to help us in Afghanistan. Now it's time for them to sit down and see how can they, if they're not willing to commit combat troops, are there logistical things they can do? Russia recently closed down a base in, I think it was Uzbekistan for us. That was a major relay route for our troops in that area. That, are there ways we can pressure Russia to help loosen those things up and let us have those? So I guess the next step I'm looking for, we've made the introductions, we've shaken the hands, we've done all of that. Now it's time to see some results. I mean, there's things like the trading agreement with Colombia we do want to see passed, and that's something that, interestingly, probably a Republican president couldn't have passed, but perhaps a Democrat could. And I think those are things that we want to see and see real movement on some of these fronts.
I just wanted to add about the tone, and it follows what Owen said, that the tone is substance as well, because a lot of, for example, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, a lot of his policy was just anti-Americanism, and that's the platform he was running on. So that, and the fact that we pursued a rather belligerent policy towards him made it easy for other countries to join with him just on a platform of anti-Americanism. But if the fact that it's kind of a divide and conquer kind of approach, and I think that it will be much more possible to get cooperation on individual issues from countries which before were just falling in line behind either Iran or, say, Venezuela, with this kind of approach. So I think that the substantive gains will be coming.
I think some of the analyses of the first 100 days have acted as if success will be, do they do what we want? And you see, that's contrary to the whole idea of a multilateralist foreign policy. The interesting question is, what can we get agreement on? What will Europe do with us? What will Latin America do with us? Will Iran help us with Afghanistan and Pakistan? Could we somehow reduce tensions between Pakistan and India in order to advance our Pakistani and Afghanistan policies, et cetera? That's a question of what other countries are willing to do. You only know that once you engage them and figure out what the limits are and whether or not. And so I think it's much too early to tell, but it's not just a matter of us having a nicer tone and then them doing what we wanted. It's a completely different approach to how you build a consensus and what power is.
Let me switch us on to Pakistan, now that you've mentioned it. I want to start with you. To what extent, let's put it this way, Pakistan's received a lot of criticism for not cracking down really on the Taliban. I mean, there's some reluctance on the part of the military to give up alliances that they forged back in the Soviet days in Afghanistan, nor are they willing to pull away from their preoccupation with India. So in this fighting that's happened, with the Pakistanis have gone in against the Taliban as they've surged closer to Islamabad, are they changing? I mean, do you think this is a real shift with the military, or is this a temporary activity?
I think it's a hard read right now. I mean, what's interesting is a lot of these same groups that they're fighting right now are the ones that they also underhandedly used to attack India in the past decade. So, you know, now they're turning on them. So I think you see the Pakistanis going aggressively after them. What I'm still uncertain of is that, you know, right now, you know, Pakistan has a democracy, but it's fledgling. It's weak. It's the main institutions of that democracy don't have a lot of stability. What does have stability, what does work, perhaps the only major organization in Pakistan that works, is the military. So I'm curious as if we're seeing almost an intentional escalation of violence in order to destabilize the country, so that you could have Kiani step in later and take over in a way that would be more acceptable than Musharraf was ever accepted in that role.
Kiani, the head of the army at
Correct.
This point. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so how do you see this? I mean, as Owen said, it's difficult to read, but what do you read into this?
It's really difficult to read, because I think that there's a lot of the Pakistanis are trying to differentiate between the various groups instead of just lumping everybody together in a war on terror, because it makes it easier from a domestic perspective, so that they won't be seen as just fighting America's war. So I think that's really important, but I don't. It seems to me that there's also a scenario, you know, an interpretation that the military was not expecting after they reached a peace deal or ceasefire with the Taliban group in the Swat Valley a few weeks ago, that they would then break that deal so quickly and move so close to Islamabad. So, and then this, of course, caused all sorts of panic, not only, I'm sure, in Pakistan, but also in the United States, sort of saying this is, you know, the state's about to collapse. So, and I think that from the U.S. perspective, it's very, very difficult. I don't think, you know, the ambassador, I think, was asking for better helicopters and night vision radar and all sorts of other things from us. I think that the United States, you know, at the bottom line, it has to try and ensure that Pakistan's nuclear weapons are safe, primarily, and then continue some of the programs that the Obama administration initiated at the beginning when he gave his speech on Pakistan and Afghanistan, and talked about working on development issues there and trying to make it so that there wasn't as much support for insurgencies. But it is a critical time. It's very difficult.
Robert, how do you see the stability of the government in Pakistan? Are they able? Who's in control, I suppose, coming from what your comments, Owen, about is it the military, is it the political side, is it neither, is it the Taliban?
Well, the political side is very weak. There's very weak civil authority. It doesn't go very far beyond Islamabad. So we know that the military is the dominant institution in the country. I think Owen's absolutely right about that. That they, as Ann says, they have a very nuanced view, much more nuanced view of these very elements of the Taliban. The Bush policy was to take all militants, all fundamentalists, and put them into one camp, and then they were all our enemy, which is where you got the impression that we're having a war against the entire Islamic world. They were actually trying to sort them out in some way, but clearly something went wrong here, because they were surprised by breaking this truce right away. And then you had, and I think it spooked a lot of Western countries. I think Hillary Clinton, when she made her statements about this, which got a lot of coverage, was spooked by them being 60 miles from Islamabad. But as Owen points out, a lot of these groups were actually encouraged by Pakistani intelligence and by the Pakistani military. So it's very hard to figure out what is going on. It could be some strange kind of end game where it's being done deliberately, but the problem with a conspiracy theory like that is that they're usually not that efficient. In other words, you assume efficiency to pull off a conspiracy, but it's a cause for concern. It doesn't seem like the Taliban forces are large enough to actually overrun Islamabad. Right. There's no real risk like that, even though just the specter of them being that close to nuclear weapons scares people. So clearly, Pakistan continues to be a place where we have a huge interest and hard to get a handle on it. And you also have this whole issue of their continuing obsession with India. And rumor is, maybe this is hopeful thinking and not really true, that maybe the Obama administration is looking at some sort of secret negotiations to try to disengage that between Pakistan and India. But that gets you back to public opinion, and you get the drone weapons coming in. They have a real issue with their own public here, which may be driving part of this. But it's obviously a fairly unstable situation, unpredictable situation.
Well, there's one thing I can predict, which is that we need to take a break. So let me ask you to hold your thoughts. We'll come back to Judge Garzon and the charges. We'll be back in just a few moments here on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus on our World Affairs Roundup. We're with Owen Robinson, Ann Hamilton, and Robert Kraig. And Robert, maybe I'll start with you, since we had you talking just before the break, about Judge Garzon and the taking steps toward bringing charges against former Bush administration officials in torture cases in Spain. And I suppose the question for me is, to what degree do you think this is a real legal issue? I mean, there is the possibility that people could be even tried in absentia in Spain from the administration, or is it, to what degree is it really just a political sort of dust-up and something that's going to be resolved politically?
I mean, I know it seems strange to a lot of people that a Spanish court could start investigating American officials from a previous administration, high-up officials. But in terms of international law, this is actually very well grounded. Both the Geneva Convention and the Convention Against Torture in 1984 say specifically that countries that are signatories have an obligation to investigate torture. We have declassified information now that indicates very clearly that torture took place and was approved way up the food chain in the U.S. government. It's a very strange situation that we actually have a major power like the United States, the world's oldest democracy, actually having strong evidence of both torture being approved and torture taking place. And so, as a matter of fact, there is some authority, a good deal of authority in international law for Judge Garzon to pursue this. I think, on the other hand, if there's an investigation in the United States, that Judge Garzon and anyone else will back off. In other words, the United States would be allowed, as long as it had some kind of procedure for looking into this, to proceed. And in fact, I think, according to the international treaties that we are signatories to, we would need to investigate, not necessarily prosecute, not necessarily indict, but certainly investigate any credible evidence of torture, and figure out whether it occurred specifically in legal terms, and who authorized it, etc. But what's been declassified, what we know so far, is extremely disturbing, and it relates back to the tone we've been talking about. It hurts America's influence and power in the world if we will not investigate ourselves. We expect to be a paragon of human rights and a leader in the world, and so it's a serious situation legally and in terms of our foreign policy.
And let me ask you, so we pick up on what Robert says. I mean, does this put President Obama, though, in a more difficult position, because he's declassified these memos in pursuit and answer to this lawsuit that was brought against the government, but he's also said he didn't want to have prosecutions. But does this put more pressure on him to do just that?
Well, there have been mixed messages, but he said he didn't want to prosecute the people who followed the orders, and hasn't made clear what his position was on the people who actually wrote the memos and directed this policy. I think to a certain extent it puts pressure on Obama, but there's already pressure on him for this. I think it's interesting that, I mean, this judge in Spain, Garzon, has a history of doing this, and he certainly, I mean, he's the one who tried to get Britain to send Augusto Pinochet back to Spain for trial, and although he ultimately wasn't successful, you could make the argument that Pinochet's ultimate trial in Chile might not have happened had Garzon not pursued it to this extent. And there are Spanish victims. So it's interesting because now they can't be tried in Spain because they were tortured in Guantanamo, so they had to be released. And the other point I want to make is that, interestingly enough, we used this concept of universal jurisdiction just last year to try the son of the Liberian president, former Liberian president, and convicted him to 97 years in prison for torturing in Liberia. This case took place in Miami. And at the time, the Attorney General of the United States, Bush's Attorney General Mukasey, said lauded this decision, said it was great, we should use this as a precedent to move forward. So we're trying people for torture in other countries here in the United States when there's no real connection to Americans as far as I know.
Oh, and how do you weed through the legal, political ramifications of this?
Well, I think we make a grave mistake both internationally and within our own nation when we start criminalizing differences of political opinion. Now, I know Robert said very, very adamantly that torture took place. That's a matter of opinion. You know, when you look at some of the things cited as torture, sleep deprivation, forced humiliation, forced nudity, things like that, is that torture? It's a matter of opinion, and I think some of those legal briefs were exactly that, saying, you know, in our opinion, this does not constitute the definition of torture, therefore it is permitted under our laws and under all the various conventions that apply. So I think when we go back, I agree it should be investigated, we should find out what we did, and we should learn from it, and we should decide where our moral compass is on those issues, how far we're willing to go, and use that lesson in the future. Going back and criminalizing it opens up a whole can of worms. You can picture a future President Giuliani going after Obama for the murder of 3 teenage pirates in the Indian Ocean without trial or any due process, or the Predator strikes, take place in Pakistan and beyond. I mean, these are things that are arguably violations of international law that, do we really want other countries starting to dig through what are differences of opinion, what are things that we're doing at the time, or do we want to learn from them and move forward?
I guess just another minute or so on this issue, but one of the issues here is you mentioned moral compass about do we need to have some sort of investigation in order to kind of preserve our own sense of the U.S. moral compass, or is that possible given the political issues at stake here? Is this going after the Bush administration again? I mean, so is it possible to get there, I guess is the question.
Well, I think, in the past we look at our history. We went back and investigated the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, or the dropping of the atomic bomb, which is still a topic of debate on any campus you'd like to go to. All the things, the cleansing, if you will, of Indians out of the West. There are things like that were horribly wrong in some cases that we have learned from and we won't do again. I think that in this political environment it'd be very difficult. If we can do it in a measured, scholarly way, I think it's wholly appropriate. If it can only be done in a political show trial, then we should wait.
I mean, the hardest thing to do is to look at yourself, right, as a country and admit this kind of wrongdoing, particularly fairly quickly, not after looking back 50 years. I think for our moral leadership in the world, it's essential that we show that kind of moral strength. In order to exercise the kind of moral leadership we want to exercise in the world, it's very difficult. Owen's absolutely right that there should be, people have due process, so you should look very carefully at, does it constitute torture? Did following the order is a different thing than saying making up a legal argument that looks like it was not. It was based on basically tailored to a political demand, if that's the case. But you look at all of that. But if we can do that, if we can show that strength as a democracy, I think it strengthens us. It doesn't weaken us. But it's a very difficult thing to do, and people do have to have their rights in the process.
And let me, I want to impose on you to transition to our last issue if we can, because we just have a couple minutes to talk about it, which is Kim Jong-il expelling the nuclear inspectors. Is this another chapter in the same old, same old? I mean, this is something that they've done with the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. How can Obama, if he can, avoid not falling into this sort of dysfunctional game with North Korea?
Well, I think that one of the suggestions is to, instead of, Kim Jong-il has said he doesn't want to be in the 6-party talks anymore. Okay, that's fine. Let's conduct 5-party talks and think about a Korea post Kim Jong-il and talk about how we're going to deal with refugee issues and all of those, and sort of exclude him completely. Don't involve him in any deals. That's what I think that's how I think is the way to go. And I don't think it's a tremendous security threat. I think that we have to be the fact fact that this is very much tied up in the whole missile defense debate needs to be acknowledged up front, so that people who are thinking about this understand the connection with that, and that those who see it as a real threat are really in favor of pursuing missile defense. Yeah, I think that we should just go ahead and pursue five-party talks and leave them out.
We are back down to, unfortunately, we're down to about a minute, and so I want to see if any of you have issues you want to put on the table that we should be watching for going forward. Robert, maybe I'll start with you.
I'll just chime in on Korea. I think that with North Korea, I think that it is not an immediate security threat. A lot of it is being driven by people who want to build ballistic missile defenses, but it is a threat to Obama's decision to try to denuclearize the world and to try to prevent further proliferation. And so that's a very important part of his new foreign policy, and it's crucial to world peace.
Any quick last word, Owen?
I think watching Russia, you see them trying to cull their military by 300,000 people, 200,000 of them officers, are extremely top-heavy. And you recently saw them sack their head of the intelligence for the military. I think watch that military.
And Ann, I'm going to use my prerogative and not call on you, unfortunately. We're out of time. Thank you, Owen Robinson, Ann Hamilton, Robert Kraig, for another great World Affairs Roundup. To our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.